In the criminal justice system, the people,
pimps, addicts, thieves, bums, winos, girls who can't keep an address, and men who don't care,
are represented by two separate yet equally important groups.
A cop, a flatfoot, a bull, a dick, John Law. You're the fuzz, the heat, you're poison, you're trouble, you're bad news.
These are their stories.
You may not know the name Joseph Fisher, but you'll know what he did. The former Pennsylvania police officer went to the U.S. Capitol and was involved in the riot on January 6th. His case was on pause because the Supreme Court, as you're aware, was considering whether one of the charges that he faced, which is obstructing an official proceeding, was being interpreted in a way that was improper when applied to riot-related criminal cases. So the Supreme Court ruled this summer that the Justice Department used this law, this obstruction law, to bring obstruction charges against hundreds of people on January 6th who don't necessarily fall into the category of the obstruction law. They did not throw out the obstruction charge against Fisher. I'm talking about the Supreme Court, but they sent the case back down to lower courts with instructions about how to assess the charge in light of the Supreme Court ruling. So when the case returned to court yesterday, the judge said that what remains of this case will go to trial in 2025. The prosecutor is saying that Fisher will face trial on other charges, but not the obstruction charges. Fisher faces 6 other charges related to the riot on January 6, including assaulting law enforcement officers and civil disorder. Fisher is one of the people that recorded himself yelling "charge" and running into the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. He said over text that protesters should drag Democrats, quote, into the street and have a mob trial, end quote. So it's acknowledged by prosecutors that bringing the case in front of a jury next year is, quote, a pretty long delay, but attorneys on the case were told that he'd try to accelerate the case and that if they have any openings in the trial schedule, they'll try to move that up. Meanwhile, in New York, federal prosecutors are saying that Nicole Torres sold election jobs to Bronx residents for $150 apiece. It's just the most recent smear on the reputation of the New York City Board of Elections. Nicole Torres, an elected district leader and one-time Republican candidate for state assembly, also forged timesheets for so-called no-show employees. Now, she pocketed salaries for those employees that were no-show employees. And this indictment was just released yesterday. And the charges against Torres are the most recent in a string of scandals in this troubled board in New York. They have been accused of failing to mail out absentee ballots, a botched rollout of the ranked choice voting system, disenfranchisement of voters, and more. Torres is 43. She's worked for the board since 2016. She made $65,430 last year, and that's not counting the no-show job money that she's pocketing. Exactly. So she was responsible for monitoring poll workers' attendance and ensuring that they were paid on Election Day during the early voting periods also, according to this indictment. Poll workers, you may be interested to know, in New York, they can earn about almost $3,000 each election cycle if they work all 9 early voting days plus Election Day. So it's not nothing. I mean, it's still public service that you're involved in, but there is compensation associated with it. And apparently, if you're selling spots, there's even more compensation associated with it. This is a big story, and as a journalist and people who care about journalism, you should very much care about this story out of Las Vegas. We showcased it at the time when it was first happening, when this journalist lost his life, and now there's a verdict in this trial. The former Las Vegas official who was tried for murder of this journalist who was critical of him That former Las Vegas official has been found guilty. This just happened yesterday. The verdict, this longtime Las Vegas reporter who wrote articles critical of this public official ended up losing his life. Shot. Was it shot or stabbed? I think maybe he was stabbed, actually, outside his home. Yeah, stabbed outside his home. Robert Tellis, who ran the county office that handles the estates of those who die without apparent heirs, Robert Tellis was the focus of several stories that Jeff German, who was the journalist, wrote about this public official, critical of this public official. A few months before his death, Mr. German wrote an article for the Las Vegas Review-Journal describing employees' complaints that Mr. Tellis had created a toxic work environment. Also, it was suggested that Tellis had demonstrated favoritism and had an improper relationship with a staff member. So Tellis denied the allegations. Then he lost a re-election bid a month after that article came out and probably surmised the article had something to do with him losing. Prosecutors said in their case that was why, on a September day, he went to German's suburban home, hid in the bushes at the side of his house, and then stabbed him to death.
Crazy.
Tellis, guilty of murder in the first degree, sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years. The chief deputy district attorney there in Las Vegas said, quote, "In the end, this case isn't about politics. It's about alleged inappropriate relationships. It's not about politics, and it's not about alleged inappropriate relationships. It's not about who's a good boss and who's a good supervisor or favoritism at work. It's just about murder." Those were her statements at the beginning of the trial. She was saying, like, don't lose this case in the crap associated with what was going on in the office or what was going on politically. This guy was murdered in cold blood, and now he's going to prison. And finally, the House GOP now releasing their own collection and mashup of videos of January 6th, and guess what they're trying to do? Blame Nancy Pelosi for the whole thing. In recordings shot for a documentary, Pelosi is raging about the attack on the Capitol and said that she took responsibility for not pushing the police to prepare better for the violence by Trump supporters. It's a remarkable thing that they are cherry-picking moments from that day to try to twist the narrative to suggest it was Pelosi's fault. The Republican-controlled House Administration Subcommittee on Oversight released video clips. Some of them apparently have never been seen before. They were shot for an HBO documentary about Pelosi. In them, she is shown on the day of the riot venting her rage about the rampage at the Capitol, criticizing security officials for failing to anticipate and prevent it, and saying she felt responsible for their failure. Okay, so they take that and they're trying to blow it up into, oh, it's Pelosi's fault that all these protesters got in there in the first place. She does rail against Mr. Trump and his role in firing up the supporters who stormed the Capitol, but she also repeatedly suggests, apparently, that she and her staff should have pushed the Capitol Police harder to make sure they were better prepared, as Mr. Trump summoned thousands of his supporters to Washington to protest the transfer of power from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. This is the quote, "I don't care what they say, they should have had much more anticipation about the National Guard." At another point, she said, "I can't believe the stupidity. I take full responsibility." Well, again, that has been used and amplified and twisted so that somehow in this release of this new video and series of videos, the GOP can suggest it was Nancy Pelosi's fault.
It's so ridiculous because didn't we see in the January 6th hearings that the Trump administration officials knew something big was going to happen? So they should have known that this was going to occur and been prepared and ready to save or protect the people in the Capitol from this violence. They should have known.
Well, the other thing is that the President of the United States watched it all on television
Did
and did nothing. That, I think, speaks volumes as well. That's law and disorder.
Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.